Lyra ducked her head as she entered the transport bay, a reflex born from years of painful encounters with door frames designed for beings much smaller than her. At nearly 2.5 meters tall, with broad shoulders and a muscular frame that dwarfed even the largest Xylans, she was a constant reminder to herself and others that she didn't belong. Not here. Not anywhere on this planet. The whispers followed her like shadows as she moved through the crowded terminal, collecting cargo containers that weighed more than most Xylans could lift. The barren giant. The useless one. She had learned to pretend not to hear, but the words still stung after all these years. The worst part wasn't the names. It was knowing they were technically correct. By Xylan standards, she was biologically defective. Her body lacked the resonance signature required for compatibility with their reproductive technology. The official designation, biologically inactive, was stamped on her identification like a brand, marking her as someone without a future in a society that valued nothing more than perfect genetic continuity. Lyra loaded the containers onto her transport cart, her movements efficient despite the confined space. The terminal had been designed for beings half her size, with low ceilings and narrow pathways that forced her to stoop and turn sideways as she navigated. Even the simple act of walking through a public space was a constant reminder of her outsider status. Station maintenance request in Sector 9, her communication device announced. All available personnel report. Sector 9, of course, the most remote, dangerous area of the outpost, where radiation levels were just within tolerable limits. No Xylan would willingly take that assignment, which was precisely why it always fell to her. The tasks no one wanted, the places no one would go. These were Lyra's domain by unspoken agreement. As she steered her cart toward the sector transit, she caught a glimpse of an announcement screen displaying information about the upcoming Genetic Continuity Festival. The screen showed delicate Xylan forms dancing in celebration of fertility and family bonds. Every year, she watched from a distance as the entire community engaged in rituals that emphasized everything she could never have or be. "Excuse me," a voice said behind her, speaking the common trade language rather than native Xylan. "You're blocking half the corridor." Lyra immediately pressed herself against the wall, a practiced movement of apology. "Sorry, I was just..." She turned and found herself looking at a human man. Not just any human, but one she had noticed before. Working in the technical division, she thought. He wasn't particularly tall for a human, perhaps 1.8 meters, with a lean build and dark hair that fell across his forehead. But what struck her most was his expression. There was no disgust there, no impatience or mockery. Just simple acknowledgement. "No problem," he said, his eyes meeting hers directly rather than skittering away as most did. Those screens are designed to catch attention. That's the point. Before she could respond, he had slipped past her with an efficiency that suggested he too had learned to navigate spaces not designed for him. Lyra watched him disappear into the crowd, momentarily forgetting the weight of the cargo behind her. In that brief interaction, he had done something almost no one on Xylos ever did. He had seen her as a person rather than an aberration. She shook herself back to awareness and continued towards Sector 9, wondering if she had imagined the encounter. It wasn't that humans were rare on Xylos. The planet had become an important multi-species trading hub over the last century. But interactions with anyone that didn't end with her feeling worse were unusual enough to be memorable. Sector 9 was as miserable as expected. The radiation shields were functioning at minimum capacity, requiring her to wear a protective suit that had been awkwardly modified to fit her frame. The maintenance work involved replacing corroded panels in ceiling conduits, work that required both height and strength, making her the obvious choice despite the risks. 4 hours later, sweating and exhausted, Lyra was finishing the final connections when she noticed someone entering the sector. Few people ever came here willingly, especially during maintenance periods. "You're supposed to have a second person for work in high radiation zones," said the same voice from earlier. The human was standing at the entrance to the conduit junction, holding additional radiation shields and a water container. "And you're supposed to have clearance to enter Sector 9 during maintenance," Lyra replied, surprised by her own boldness. He smiled slightly. "I do. Technical Specialist Cale Mercer. I'm supposed to check the calibration on the new panels once they're installed. He offered the water container. Thought you might need this. Lyra hesitated before accepting it. No one had ever brought her water before. Thanks, she said cautiously. I'm almost done. No rush, Cale said, setting up his equipment nearby. I'll wait. As she returned to her work, she could feel his presence. Not hovering, not staring, just there. Occasionally she would glance down and see him quietly working on his datapad, consulting reference materials or checking his instruments. He seemed entirely comfortable with the silence between them. When she finally descended from the conduit, he approached with his calibration tools. Mind if I check your work? It's your job, isn't it? Lyra responded, surprised again by the near-conversational tone that had developed. Technically, he agreed, but I prefer to ask rather than assume. As he climbed up to check the panels, using a hover lift that Lyra never bothered with due to her height, she found herself studying him more carefully. There was something about him that seemed not quite aligned with Xylan society either. Not physical, like her difference, but something in his manner, the way he carried himself. When he finished, he nodded approvingly. Perfect alignment. Better than most of the contractors do it. I've had practice, Lyra said, beginning to pack up her tools. I can tell. He paused. You're assigned to Sector 12 tomorrow, right? The atmospheric recycler maintenance. Lyra stiffened. How did you know that? I'm scheduled to calibrate there too, he explained. Just wondering if we might coordinate timing. Those recyclers are tricky. There was no reason for suspicion. Yet Lyra had learned to question any interaction that didn't immediately feel hostile. Standard shift, starting at 0600, she finally said. I'll be there at 0800, he replied. Should give you enough time to do the mechanical work before I need to tinker with the electronics. With that, he gathered his equipment and left, leaving Lyra to wonder if she had just experienced a normal work conversation for the first time in years. The next day, Cale arrived precisely when he said he would. And the day after that. And the day after that. Soon, it became routine to see him at her work sites, always with a legitimate reason to be there, always professional but kind. He would bring water sometimes, or adjust equipment to better fit her reach without comment. Once, when a Xylan supervisor made a cutting remark about the primitive brute labor being completed, Cale smoothly diverted the conversation to technical specifications until the supervisor lost interest and left. They rarely spoke beyond what was necessary for their work, but Lyra began to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere around them. It was as if a tiny bubble of acceptance had formed, just large enough to encompass the two of them within the otherwise hostile environment of Xylos. 3 weeks into this new pattern, Lyra was assigned to repair a communication relay station in the most remote part of the outpost, a full day's journey by transport. The assignment would require an overnight stay due to the distance and complexity of the repairs. She was loading her equipment when Cale appeared. I'm coming with you, he said without preamble. The station's been showing calibration errors for months. Management finally approved a full diagnostic. Lyra studied him suspiciously. That's a lot of hours in a small transport. I've spent longer in smaller spaces, he replied with a slight shrug. Besides, we both know those relays need more than physical repairs. The signal modulation has been degrading for months. She couldn't argue with his logic, even if she questioned the timing. The journey passed mostly in silence, but not an uncomfortable one. Occasionally, Cale would comment on the terrain they passed or ask a technical question about the relay system. By the time they reached the station, Lyra had spoken more words to another person than she had in the previous year combined. The relay station was barely more than a reinforced shed perched on the edge of a plateau, with spectacular views of Xylos's violet-tinged mountains stretching to the horizon. Inside, it was cramped with equipment, leaving barely enough room for one person to work, let alone someone of Lyra's size alongside another technician. I'll work from the external access panel, Cale offered immediately, seeming to understand her discomfort without her having to explain. You take the main console. Your reach will make it easier to access the upper components. They worked steadily until the twin suns began to set, painting the mountains in shades of deep purple and gold. The temperature dropped rapidly with the fading light. "We should finish in the morning," Kale said, closing the access panel. The diagnostic cycle needs to run overnight anyway. The station contained a single, small sleeping alcove, clearly designed for emergency use by maintenance workers. It was barely large enough for a standard Xylan, let alone someone of Lyra's proportions. "I'll sleep in the transport," she said automatically. "The temperature drops to sub-zero out here at night," Kale objected. "The transport's environmental controls aren't designed for overnight use. I've managed before." "You shouldn't have to manage," he said, a flash of something harder entering his voice. "Look, I'll take the transport. You take the alcove." "That's ridiculous. You'd freeze." "So would you." They stared at each other for a moment before Kale sighed. "Neither of us should freeze. We're adults. We can share the sleeping space and the thermal blankets. It's simple survival." Something about the matter-of-fact way he presented the solution disarmed her usual defenses. There was no hint of anything inappropriate in his suggestion, just practical problem-solving. "Fine," she agreed reluctantly. The night was awkward at first, with both of them trying to maintain a respectful distance in a space that made such distance impossible. Eventually, however, exhaustion won out over discomfort, and they fell asleep. Lyra woke to find herself curled toward Kale, his body providing warmth in the chilly alcove. For a moment, before full consciousness returned, she allowed herself to feel the simple comfort of another person's proximity without judgment or fear. Then reality reasserted itself, and she carefully extracted herself from the sleeping space. They completed the repairs by midday, working together with an efficiency that surprised even Lyra. As they packed up their equipment, a magnetic storm warning flashed across their communication devices. "We shouldn't travel in that," Kale said, frowning at the alert. "These plateaus are notorious for storm intensification." Lyra checked the forecast. "It looks like it will pass by morning." "Guess we're staying another night," he said, not sounding particularly bothered by the prospect. With the work completed and no immediate way to return to the main outpost, they found themselves with something they'd never had before: time without purpose. After a stilted hour of systems checks that didn't need checking, Kale finally broke the pattern. "Can I ask you something?" he said, sitting down on the floor of the station, his back against the wall. Lyra tensed but nodded. "Why do you stay on Xylos? There are plenty of worlds where your skills would be valued without." He gestured vaguely. All this. No one had ever asked her that before. The question pierced through layers of resignation she hadn't realized had formed around her heart. "It's not that simple," she finally said, joining him on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest. "Transport off-world is expensive. Employment contract for non-Xylans have penalties for early termination. And," she hesitated, "I don't know where I would go. At least here, I understand the rules, even if they're not in my favor." Kale nodded slowly. "The devil you know." "Something like that," she agreed. "What about you? You don't seem entirely at home here, either." A shadow crossed his face. "I have my reasons for being on the fringes of Xylan society. Let's just say I have professional disagreements with certain scientific and ethical positions that are widely accepted here." "What kind of disagreements?" He seemed to consider how much to share. "I believe their obsession with genetic purity and resonance compatibility is not just ethically questionable, but scientifically flawed. Their reproductive technology is impressive, but their understanding of biological diversity is dangerously limited." He glanced at her. "In my opinion," the words hung between them, radical and almost treasonous in Xylan terms. "Those are dangerous thoughts," Lyra said quietly. "So, is being different in any way?" he replied. "Yet here we both are." Something shifted in that moment, a recognition of shared outsider status, of finding unexpected understanding in a place where neither of them truly belonged. As the evening progressed, they shared their meals and, gradually, more of themselves. Lyra spoke of her childhood in the human colonies before coming to Xylos, of the slow realization that her physical differences would forever mark her as unsuitable in Xylan society. Kale told her about his work in cross-species biological systems, theories that had made him increasingly unpopular in academic circles dominated by Xylan purists. "They call me the contaminator behind my back," he said with a wry smile, "because I suggested that their sacred resonance patterns might actually benefit from external influence." "At least it's more creative than Barren Giant," Lyra replied, surprising herself by joking about the painful nickname. Kale laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to fill the small space with unexpected warmth. "True, Xylan creativity tends to be limited to their architecture, not their insults." They talked until late into the night, the magnetic storm creating spectacular light displays visible through the station's single observation window. Somewhere in those hours of conversation, Lyra realized she had never before felt so seen, so heard, so understood. When they finally returned to the main outpost the following day, something fundamental had changed. Though they returned to their normal work routines, there was now an unspoken connection between them. They began to seek each other's company during meal breaks, sitting at the corner table in the communal dining hall where Lyra usually ate alone. They would discuss their work projects or sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, a small island of acceptance amid the sea of Xylan conformity. The whispers changed. Now Lyra heard the giant's pet human or the defect pair when she passed groups of Xylan workers. But somehow, with Kale's steady presence in her life, the words seemed to lose some of their power to wound. As weeks passed, their connection deepened. They began to meet after work hours, walking along the less populated pathways at the outpost's edge or sitting in the small observation dome that few Xylans frequented due to its distance from the central hub. In these quiet spaces, away from judging eyes, they continued to share pieces of themselves. "I used to dream of having a family," Lyra admitted one evening as they watched Xylos's 3 moons rise above the horizon. "Before I knew it was impossible." Kale was quiet for a long moment. "Who decided it was impossible?" he finally asked. "Biology. Medical science. The Xylan Reproductive Authority," she replied with a bitter laugh. "Take your pick. The same authorities who claim cross-species cellular harmonization is theoretically impossible," he asked, a strange intensity in his voice. "Because I've seen evidence to the contrary in my research." Lyra turned to look at him, uncertain what he was suggesting. "I'm just saying," he continued carefully, "that Xylan medical science isn't infallible, despite what they believe." She didn't allow herself to consider what he might be implying. Hope was a luxury she had surrendered long ago. The first time he touched her was an accident. They were exiting the observation dome when a system malfunction caused the doors to close suddenly. Kale reflexively pulled her back, his hand catching her arm. The contact was brief, but Lyra felt it like an electric current through her body, the first gentle touch she had experienced in years. "Sorry," he said immediately, releasing her. "It's okay," she replied, surprised to find that it truly was. After that, small touches became part of their interaction, a hand briefly on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing tools, standing close enough that their arms occasionally made contact. Each touch was casual, innocent, yet Lyra found herself increasingly aware of Kale's physical presence, of the warmth that seemed to radiate from him. The night everything changed began ordinarily enough. They had finished their evening meal and were walking toward the residence units when a group of young Xylans blocked their path. "Look at the breeding rejects," one of them called out, emboldened by the group's numbers. "Think they can contaminate our genetic lines?" Lyra automatically stepped back, accustomed to avoiding confrontation, but Kale didn't move. "Your genetic anxiety is showing," he said calmly. "Might want to have that checked. I hear insecurity can affect resonance patterns." The Xylan's facial membranes flushed deep blue with anger. "You're not welcome here, contaminator. Neither is your oversized pet." Something in Lyra snapped. Years of silently accepting abuse suddenly seemed intolerable. "My name," she said, stepping forward her full height, "is Lyra. Not giant. Not defect. Lyra." The Xylans faltered, unaccustomed to direct confrontation from those they considered inferior. After a tense moment, they moved aside, muttering threats but unwilling to escalate the situation. As Lyra and Kale continued walking, she realized she was trembling, not with fear, but with a strange exhilaration. For the first time, she had claimed her identity in the face of those who wished to reduce her to a label. That was impressive, Kale said quietly when they reached her residence unit. It felt, Lyra searched for the right word, necessary. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite define. "Would you like me to come in?" he asked, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. Lyra hesitated only briefly before nodding. Her living space was Spartan, designed for utility rather than comfort, with furniture that was still too small for her frame despite modifications. Kale looked around with interest, but made no comment on the accommodations. "I don't know what this is," Lyra said when the door closed behind them, gesturing vaguely between them. "I don't know what we're doing." "Neither do I exactly," Kale admitted. "But I think we're discovering it. Together." He stepped closer, slowly enough that she could have moved away if she wished. She didn't. When he reached up to touch her face, she had to bend slightly to meet his hand. The gesture, him reaching up, her bending down, felt like a perfect metaphor for how they had been bridging their differences all along. "Is this okay?" he asked, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. In answer, Lyra leaned down and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them adjusting to each other, finding their way. Then something clicked into place, and the uncertainty dissolved into a hunger neither had allowed themselves to acknowledge. Her concerns about her size, about hurting him or being too much, faded as Kale responded with equal intensity. His hands moved with confidence, finding ways to bridge their physical differences with a creativity born of genuine desire. When they finally moved to her sleeping platform, reinforced to support her weight, Lyra stopped thinking about all the ways her body had been deemed wrong and simply experienced the joy of being touched, desired, accepted exactly as she was. Afterward, lying together in the dim light, Kale traced patterns on her skin as if mapping a new territory. "You're extraordinary," he said softly. "Every part of you." For the first time in her adult life, Lyra believed it might be true. In the weeks that followed, they created a life within the narrow confines of what was possible on Xylos. Their work responsibilities remained the same, but now they spent every free moment together, discovering each other in ways that went far beyond the physical. Kale shared his research with her, complex theories about cross-species compatibility that she didn't fully understand but appreciated for the passion with which he explained them. Lyra taught him survival skills she had learned in remote regions of the planet, places where her size and strength were advantages rather than defects. They were careful to maintain professional distance in public, but the change in their relationship did not go unnoticed. The whispers evolved again, now tinged with a disgusted fascination. Several times, Lyra was called for random health screenings by Xylan medical authorities, thinly veiled attempts to find a reason to separate them. Kale faced increased scrutiny in his laboratory work, with resources mysteriously becoming unavailable and access to certain facilities restricted. Yet despite these pressures, they found a happiness neither had thought possible on Xylos. In the privacy of Lyra's quarters, they created their own world where differences were strengths and connection transcended physical or societal constraints. The first sign that something was changing came about 3 months after their relationship began. Lyra woke one morning feeling unusually fatigued, her body heavy in a way that exercise and proper rest didn't seem to alleviate. She dismissed it as a minor illness, perhaps exposure to something in one of the remote sectors where she worked. Then came the sensitivity to smells, particularly in the communal dining hall where the mixed aromas of various species food preparations had never bothered her before. Now, certain Xylan spices made her stomach lurch uncomfortably, forcing her to avoid meals during peak hours. "You should get checked," Kale suggested one evening when she mentioned the symptoms. "It could be an environmental reaction." "By Xylan medics?" Lyra scoffed. "They'd be more likely to claim, 'I'm having an allergic reaction to your presence.'" He smiled, but there was concern beneath the expression. "I have access to basic diagnostic equipment in my lab. Not comprehensive, but enough to rule out common issues. She agreed, more to ease his worry than out of any real concern for herself. Her body had always been resilient, even in the harsh silos environment. Whatever this was, she assumed it would pass. The following evening, after most workers had left the research sector, Cale brought her to his small laboratory. The space was cluttered with equipment, some standard and some that appeared to be of his own design. He motioned her to sit on a reinforced examination platform while he prepared a handheld scanner. "This will just give us basic metabolic readings," he explained, activating the device. "Nothing invasive." Lyra watched as he moved the scanner over her torso, his expression professionally focused as he interpreted the readings on the small display. Suddenly, he stopped, the scanner hovering over her lower abdomen. He frowned, adjusted something on the device, and scanned the area again. "What is it?" Lyra asked, tension creeping into her voice. "Am I sick?" Cale looked up, his expression a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and something else she couldn't identify. "Not sick, no." He hesitated. "According to these readings, you're pregnant." The words made no sense to her. "That's impossible," she said. "Automatically. I'm biologically inactive. Incompatible. The Xylan tests." With Xylan reproductive technology, Cale interrupted gently. This didn't involve Xylan methods." Lyra stared at him, the implications slowly dawning. "But humans have difficulty conceiving without assistance, even when they're the same size. And we're different," he finished for her, "but apparently not incompatible." He set the scanner down and took her hands in his. "Lyra, I need to tell you something I should have disclosed sooner. My research, it's not just theoretical. I've been studying actual cases of cross-species fertility, specifically focusing on humans with non-standard physical variations." She pulled her hands away. "You used me as a research subject?" "No." The denial was immediate and vehement. "Never. I wouldn't." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "My research led me to believe that the Xylan categorization of you as biologically inactive was flawed, that your reproductive system was likely completely functional, just not compatible with their technology. But I never expected. This wasn't a planned experiment, Lyra. This was us connecting in a way that apparently transcended physical differences." She placed a protective hand over her abdomen, mind racing. "A baby? My baby? Our baby?" Cale nodded, still looking stunned himself. "According to these readings, yes. About 11 weeks developed." Lyra felt a surge of emotions too complex to name. Wonder, terror, protectiveness, and beneath it all, a fierce joy that took her breath away. "They'll take it away," she whispered, cold fear replacing the momentary joy. "The Xylan authorities, they'll claim it's a biological aberration. They'll want to study it or—" "We won't let that happen," Cale said firmly, the uncertainty in his expression hardening into resolve. "We have options. We could leave Xylos. I have contacts on other worlds. Or, they'd never let us leave now," Lyra interrupted. "Not with this. My contract has 3 more years, and with the penalties." She thought quickly. "Could we hide it? Just until we find a way off-planet." Cale considered this. "Your size works in our favor. Physical changes might not be as obvious. But the medical screenings they've been subjecting you to would eventually detect it." "Then what do we do?" Lyra asked, fear and protectiveness warring within her. He was quiet for a long moment. "We confront them," he finally said. "Not immediately, but when we're prepared. We present them with an undeniable truth that challenges their entire system of belief about biological compatibility. Using our child as the evidence." Lyra asked, uncomfortable with the idea. "Using the fact of our child's existence," Cale clarified. "Not exposing the child itself to scrutiny. There's a difference." The distinction mattered to Lyra. She looked down at her still flat stomach, trying to comprehend that a new life was growing there, something the entire Xylan scientific establishment had deemed impossible. "We'll be okay?" she asked softly. "Physically, I mean, given our differences." "I don't know," Cale admitted, "but I'll do everything in my power to ensure both of you are healthy. I have some equipment here, and I can obtain more through unofficial channels." We'll monitor the development closely. He moved to stand beside her, his hand hovering near her abdomen. May I? Lyra nodded, and he placed his hand gently over hers. Both of them now connected to the miracle neither had thought possible. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we face it together. The following months required careful planning and constant vigilance. Lyra continued her work duties, using her size to her advantage, as Kale had suggested. Her pregnancy remained largely undetectable beneath her already substantial frame. They adjusted her assignments when possible, with Kale using his technical expertise to find reasons why certain hazardous environments needed to be avoided due to equipment sensitivities. Through it all, they marveled at the changes in Lyra's body, subtle shifts that only they knew to look for. Kale's makeshift prenatal care setup in his laboratory grew more sophisticated as he acquired additional equipment through trusted contacts. Each scan, each detected heartbeat, each milestone reached was a private celebration. The development looks completely normal, Kale reported one night, reviewing the latest scan results in Lyra's quarters. Size proportions are consistent with standard human parameters. Not Xylan parameters? Lyra asked curiously. Not primarily, no. Though there are some interesting variations in cellular structure that might indicate a very subtle influence from the Xylo's environment. He looked up with a reassuring smile. Nothing concerning, just fascinating from a scientific perspective. As her pregnancy progressed past the 6-month mark, maintaining secrecy became increasingly difficult. Lyra's movements were more deliberate now, protective of the life within her. Though her size continued to conceal most changes, she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she never had before. The decision to approach the Xylan authorities was forced upon them when Lyra was summoned for a comprehensive medical examination, a new requirement supposedly being implemented for all non-Xylan workers in high-risk positions. It's targeted, Kale said grimly when she showed him the notification. Someone suspects something. Lyra felt a surge of protective instinct, her hand moving automatically to her swollen abdomen. Then we make the first move, she said with sudden clarity. We don't wait for them to discover it on their terms. The next morning, they requested an audience with the Xylan Biological Oversight Committee, citing a matter of significant scientific importance. The unusual nature of the request, coming from a human scientist and a worker classified as biologically defective, guaranteed them the attention they sought, if not the reception they hoped for. The committee chamber was imposing by design, a circular room with elevated seating for the 7 Xylan officials who governed all matters related to biological research and regulation. The architecture emphasized the smallness of those who came to petition, with towering walls and deliberately uncomfortable acoustics that made non-Xylan speech patterns sound harsh and primitive. For once, Lyra was grateful for her height as she stood before them, Kale at her side. She did not hunch or try to appear smaller as she usually did in Xylan spaces. Instead, she stood at her full height, her pregnancy now visible in the simple, fitted clothing she had chosen specifically for this confrontation. The committee members stared, their facial membranes pulsing with colors that indicated shock, disgust, and scientific curiosity in equal measure. What is the meaning of this? The head commissioner asked, their voice deliberately modulated to convey authority. We are here to present evidence that challenges the current Xylan understanding of biological compatibility, Kale stated, his voice steady and professional. Specifically, the classification of certain human physiological variations as biologically inactive. You refer to the aberration displayed by the maintenance worker. Another commissioner responded dismissively. This is well-established science. Her reproductive incapacity has been documented through multiple screenings. Incapacity with Xylan reproductive technology, Kale corrected. Not reproductive incapacity in absolute terms. He activated a datapad and projected a series of medical images into the center of the chamber. Ultrasound images of the child growing within Lyra, alongside vital statistics that clearly demonstrated normal, healthy development. The chamber erupted in exclamations, the Xylan officials speaking rapidly in their native language, too fast for the translation devices to keep up. Phrases like contamination risk and genetic abomination cut through the cacophony. Lyra stood silently, letting her body speak the truth that no data could convey more powerfully. She was creating life, the very thing they had declared her incapable of doing. The head commissioner finally restored order, their membrane now pulsing a deep purple that indicated intense concentration. These images could be falsified. We require verification through our own medical facilities. We anticipated that request, Kale replied. We are prepared to submit to examination under specific conditions that ensure the safety and dignity of both mother and child. What followed was a tense negotiation of terms, with Kale demonstrating an unexpected skill in diplomatic maneuvering. By the end, an agreement was reached. Lyra would undergo examination by Xylan medical specialists, but Kale would be present as an observer, and all findings would be shared with both parties. The 3 days of testing that followed were exhausting for Lyra, both physically and emotionally. She endured scans, samples, and scrutiny beyond anything she had experienced before. The Xylan medical specialists treated her as a curiosity, an anomaly to be studied rather than a person carrying new life. Only Kale's steadfast presence kept her focused on why they were doing this, not to satisfy Xylan's scientific curiosity, but to establish the truth that would protect their child's future. On the 4th day, they were summoned back to the committee chamber. The atmosphere was markedly different, the previous hostility replaced by a wary scientific interest. Our findings confirm the viability of the gestation, the head commissioner announced without preamble. However, this raises serious concerns about genetic stability and environmental impact. The Oversight Committee recommends immediate medical intervention to terminate the pregnancy and preserve biological samples for further study. Lyra felt as though she'd been struck. Despite anticipating resistance, the clinical callousness of the recommendation hit her like a physical blow. Before she could respond, Kale stepped forward. With respect, Commissioners, your recommendation constitutes a human rights violation under Interstellar Coalition law, of which Xylos is a signatory member. Any attempt to forcibly terminate a viable human pregnancy or to claim rights to genetic material without consent would result in immediate sanctions. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable warning. Lyra realized he had prepared for this moment more thoroughly than she had understood. Furthermore, Kale continued, his voice gaining strength, the existence of this pregnancy is not merely a personal matter, but proof of a significant scientific discovery about human reproductive compatibility. A discovery that could benefit many species, including Xylans. The committee members conferred quietly among themselves, their facial membranes shifting through colors that indicated intense debate. Finally, the head commissioner spoke again. The committee will withhold final judgment on this matter pending the birth outcome, they announced. Until such time, subject Lyra will remain under medical supervision with regular monitoring. Any attempt to leave Xylos will be considered a violation of your employment contract and research protocols. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. As they left the chamber, Lyra felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. "Did you expect that response?" she asked Kale as they walked through the corridors, acutely aware of the stares following them. "I hoped for it," he admitted. "They're scientists first, bureaucrats second. Their curiosity about the outcome will temporarily outweigh their adherence to dogma." "And after the birth?" Lyra asked, the question that had been haunting her. Kale squeezed her hand gently. "One battle at a time. We've bought ourselves months to prepare for whatever comes next." The medical supervision mandated by the committee proved to be a mixture of genuine prenatal care and invasive surveillance. Lyra was required to report for examinations 3 times per week, each more comprehensive than any she had experienced during the secret months of her pregnancy. Samples were taken, scans were performed, and endless questions were asked about her physical state and daily activities. Kale was permitted to attend these sessions as an observer, a concession he had fought hard to secure. His presence provided Lyra with both emotional support and a scientific advocate who could challenge any procedures that seemed unnecessary or potentially harmful. Beyond the medical center, life changed dramatically. Lyra was removed from her maintenance duties and placed on biological study leave, a designation that maintained her basic income while requiring her participation in the medical monitoring program. Their movements within the outpost were subtly restricted through access limitations and security measures that always seemed to coincide with their planned destinations. Most significantly, the social isolation they had previously experienced transformed into unwanted attention. Wherever they went, they were watched, by ordinary Xylans curious about the phenomenon they represented, by medical personnel tracking Lyra's condition, and by security forces ensuring they didn't attempt to leave. "I feel like a specimen in a zoo," Lyra confessed one evening in their quarters, where they at least had the illusion of privacy. "Everything I do, every expression on my face, is being analyzed and recorded." Kale sat beside her on the reinforced couch they had managed to acquire, a rare accommodation to her size. "I know," he said, his hand resting gently on her swollen abdomen. "But remember why we're enduring this. Not for their benefit, but for ours." As if in agreement, the baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, causing them both to smile. "Strong," Kale observed. "Like mother." "And stubborn," Lyra added. "Like father." They had begun to plan more concretely for the future, though they kept these discussions for the rare moments when they felt certain they weren't being monitored. Kale had established communications with off-world contacts, former colleagues, and a few sympathetic representatives from the Interstellar Coalition. These connections were their insurance policy, a way to ensure that the Xylan authorities wouldn't be able to simply disappear them or their child after the birth. As Lyra's pregnancy entered its final weeks, the medical oversight intensified. The Xylan specialists, having never observed a human gestation up close, especially one involving a woman of Lyra's size, were simultaneously fascinated and anxious about the impending birth. Multiple scenarios were planned for, equipment was modified to accommodate her proportions, and a team of specialists was assembled to document every aspect of the process. "They're treating this like a scientific expedition," Lyra observed during one particularly invasive examination. "Let them," Kale replied quietly. "Their scientific curiosity is working in our favor. The more invested they become in the outcome, the harder it will be for them to take actions against us later." The birth itself came earlier than expected. Lyra woke in the night with intense contractions that rapidly progressed. By the time they reached the medical center, the process was well advanced. The Xylan medical team scrambled to implement their carefully prepared protocols, but the reality of human childbirth, messy, primal, and following its own timeline, confounded their attempts at clinical control. Lyra, drawing on a strength she hadn't known she possessed, followed her body's instincts despite the chaos of conflicting instructions around her. Kale never left her side, his hand gripped in hers, his voice a steady anchor as the contractions intensified. "You're doing wonderfully," he assured her. "Your body knows exactly what to do." After hours of labor that tested the limits of her endurance, their daughter entered the world with a powerful cry that seemed to momentarily silence the entire medical team. She was smaller than might be expected given Lyra's size, a perfect, average-sized human baby with a dusting of dark hair like her father's and eyes that, when briefly opened, showed hints of Lyra's deep amber color. "She's beautiful," Kale whispered as the baby was placed on Lyra's chest, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." For a few precious moments, the three of them existed in a bubble of wonder, the Xylan medical staff and their instruments temporarily forgotten. Lyra felt a connection unlike anything she had ever experienced, a fierce, overwhelming love coupled with an equally powerful instinct to protect. The moment of privacy was brief. Soon, the specialists moved in with their instruments, eager to examine the newborn. Kale immediately stepped between them and Lyra. "Standard post-birth bonding period first," he stated firmly. 30 minutes minimum before any non-emergency procedures. That was part of our agreement. There was resistance, but Kale held firm, citing specific clauses in the arrangement they had negotiated with the Oversight Committee. Reluctantly, the medical team withdrew to a respectful distance, continuing their observations but temporarily halting their interventions. "Thank you," Lyra murmured, her attention focused on the tiny being nestled against her skin. "Always," Kale replied simply, sitting beside them on the edge of the birthing platform. They named her Nova, a word signifying new beginnings, a bright light emerging from darkness. The name seemed fitting for a child whose very existence challenged long-held beliefs and opened possibilities previously thought impossible. The days following Nova's birth brought new challenges. The Xylan authorities, having confirmed the successful delivery of a healthy human child, were now faced with the implications of this reality. Emergency sessions of various governing bodies were convened. Debates raged about policies concerning cross-species fertility and security around Lyra. Kale and Nova was doubled. "They're afraid," Kale observed, watching a new set of guards take position outside their quarters, which had been relocated to a more secure section of the medical facility. "What we've proven threatens the foundation of their social hierarchy." "What happens now?" Lyra asked, cradling Nova as she slept. "We've given them what they wanted: proof, data, a successful birth. But they're still keeping us isolated. Now we execute the next phase of our plan," Kale said quietly. He moved closer, speaking near her ear. "My contacts have arranged transport. 3 days from now, during the shift change of the southern port. Everything is in place." Lyra's eyes widened slightly, but she gave no other indication of surprise. They had discussed escape scenarios, but she hadn't realized the plans had progressed so far. "Are you certain it's safe?" she whispered. "As certain as we can be," he replied. "The alternative is remaining here indefinitely as research subjects, all 3 of us." The thought of Nova growing up as a specimen to be studied, always under observation, never truly free, solidified Lyra's resolve. 3 days, she agreed. Those 3 days passed with excruciating slowness. They maintained their routine, cooperating with the medical examinations, answering questions with appropriate deference, giving no indication that they were anything but resigned to their circumstances. All the while, they carefully gathered what few possessions they would take, primarily items for Nova's care and critical data Kale had collected throughout the pregnancy and birth. On the morning of the 3rd day, an unexpected visitor arrived at their quarters. Dr. Vela, a senior member of the medical team who had shown occasional moments of compassion during Lyra's pregnancy. "I've come to inform you of a committee decision," the doctor announced, their facial membranes a neutral blue-gray that revealed little emotion. "Beginning tomorrow, the infant will be transferred to a specialized development facility for more comprehensive study. You will be permitted supervised visitation on a schedule to be determined." Lyra felt her heart freeze. "That wasn't part of our agreement," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady as Nova slept in the cradle beside her. "The agreement covered pregnancy and birth," Dr. Vela replied. "Developmental study falls under different protocols." After the doctor left, Lyra turned to Kale with barely contained panic. "We have to go now. Today. The transport isn't scheduled until tonight," Kale reminded her, his own expression grim. "We'd never make it through security without the distraction that's been arranged." "They're going to take her, Kale," Lyra said, her voice breaking. "They're going to take our daughter." Kale was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing their limited options. "I think," he finally said, "it's time to call in our last resort." The last resort turned out to be an unexpected ally, Dr. Vela themselves. Unknown to Lyra, Kale had been cultivating a cautious relationship with the Xylan physician, sharing research data that hinted at broader implications for Xylan reproductive science. The doctor, it seemed, had developed doubts about the ethical framework of their society's approach to biological diversity. When Dr. Vela returned that evening, ostensibly to conduct a final examination before the next day's separation, they brought with them medical transport credentials and access codes that would allow passage through the southern port security checkpoints. The night shift supervisor has been called away to an emergency in the eastern sector, the doctor informed them quietly. You have approximately 40 minutes before a replacement arrives. Lyra stared at the Xylan in disbelief. Why are you helping us? The doctor's membranes pulsed with a color Lyra had never seen before, something between sorrow and determination. Because what we are doing is wrong, they said simply, and because your child deserves more than to be a research subject. Their escape from the medical facility was tense but unobstructed, Dr. Vela's credentials overriding the usual security protocols. They moved quickly through service corridors, Lyra carrying Nova securely against her chest, Kale leading the way with the small bag of essentials they had prepared. At the southern port, they faced their most significant challenge, the final checkpoint before reaching the transport bay where, if all had gone according to plan, a small interstellar vessel was waiting with pre-filed departure clearance. Dr. Vela's credentials again proved invaluable, the systems accepting the authorization without question. This is where we part ways, the doctor said as they reached the final security door. For my own protection, I must return and report the credentials stolen. It will buy you some additional time. Thank you, Lyra said, meaning it more deeply than words could express. Your actions won't be forgotten. Perhaps someday, Dr. Vela replied. Xylos will be ready for the truths you've shown us. With that, they turned and disappeared back down the corridor. The transport bay was dimly lit and staffed with only a skeleton crew, most of whom were occupied with a larger cargo vessel at the opposite end. Their own transport, a modest but well-maintained ship designed for long-range scientific expeditions, waited in a secondary launch position, its systems already humming with pre-flight preparations. They boarded without incident, securing Nova in a makeshift infant carrier Kale had adapted from standard equipment. The vessel's automated systems recognized the clearance codes provided by Kale's off-world contacts, beginning the launch sequence as soon as they were safely aboard. As the ship lifted from a port, rising through Xylos's violet-tinged atmosphere, Lyra held Nova close, watching through the viewport as the only home she had known for years receded below them. She felt no regret, only a profound sense of liberation mixed with lingering disbelief that they had actually succeeded. Where are we going? She asked as the ship broke free of the planet's gravity well and the stars came into view. A research outpost in the Tau Ceti system, Kale replied, joining her at the viewport after setting the navigation coordinates. It's independent, multi-species, with a focus on xenobiology. My former mentor is the director. We'll be welcome there, all three of us. As specimens? Lyra asked, unable to completely shake the fear that had dominated their lives for so long. As colleagues, Kale corrected gently, as a family with a unique perspective on cross-species compatibility. And, he added with a smile, as the parent of the first child to break one of the galaxy's most entrenched scientific assumptions. Nova stirred in Lyra's arms, opening her eyes to gaze up at her parents with an expression of perfect contentment, unaware of the boundaries she had already helped to break simply by existing. 6 months later, Lyra stood on the observation deck of the Tau Ceti research station, watching the swirl of cosmic dust in the nearby nebula. Nova was strapped to her chest in a carrier designed specifically for her size, happily babbling as she reached toward the spectacular light display. Life at the research station had proven to be everything Kale had promised and more. Here, Lyra's size was not a defect, but an adaptation perfectly suited for certain environments and tasks. Her strength and endurance, combined with the knowledge of systems maintenance she had developed on Xylos, made her a valued member of the station's operations team. Kale had resumed his research, now with the full support of colleagues who appreciated the significance of what they had discovered. Most importantly, Nova was thriving. At 6 months, she showed no signs of any developmental issues despite the unique circumstances of her conception and gestation. If anything, she seemed more alert and adaptively responsive than typical human infants of her age, a subject of friendly debate among the xenobiologists about whether this might be an effect of the Xylos environment during pregnancy. Beautiful view, Kale said, joining them at the viewport. He slipped an arm around Lyra's waist, a gesture that still sometimes surprised her with its easy affection. It is, she agreed. Nova loves the colors. Their daughter confirmed this by reaching excitedly toward the nebula's shifting patterns, her small hand opening and closing as if trying to catch the light. I received a communication from Dr. Vela today, Kale said after a moment. The first since we left. Lyra turned to him in surprise. What did they say? That our case has sparked significant debate within the Xylan scientific community. There's a growing faction advocating for a re-evaluation of their biological compatibility theories. And, he added with a slight smile, the term biologically inactive has been officially removed from their classification system. Lyra felt a complicated mixture of emotions at this news. Satisfaction that their struggle had sparked change, alongside lingering pain from the years of rejection she had endured under that label. It's a start, she said finally. Kale nodded. A small one, but important. Nova chose that moment to pat Lyra's face demandingly, clearly unimpressed with the adult conversation when there were colors to be observed. Both parents laughed, turning their attention back to their daughter and the cosmic display beyond the viewport. Later that night, after Nova had been settled in her crib, Lyra stood looking down at her sleeping form. The small quarters they had been assigned were modest but comfortable, designed with attention to Lyra's proportions, a consideration she was still getting used to after years of adapting herself to spaces that never accommodated her. Kale joined her, slipping his arms around her from behind. What are you thinking about? He asked, resting his head against her shoulder. How different her life will be from mine, Lyra replied softly. She'll never know what it's like to be told her body is wrong, to be defined by what she supposedly can't do. No, she won't, Kale agreed. But she'll know your story. Someday, she'll understand the strength it took for you to survive that, to hold on to yourself when an entire society tried to tell you who you were. Lyra turned in his embrace to face him. Our story, she corrected. I wouldn't be here without you. None of this would have happened if you hadn't seen me, really seen me, when no one else did. I only saw what was already there, he said. Your strength, your resilience, your capacity for love despite everything you'd endured. All I did was refuse to accept the limitations others had placed on you. She bent to kiss him, still marveling at how naturally they fit together despite their physical differences. Is that all? She teased gently. Well, he admitted with a smile, I might also have had a scientist's curiosity about challenging established theories. Lucky for me, Lyra said, her voice growing serious again. Lucky for Nova. Their daughter slept on peacefully, secure in the knowledge, even if only on the most primal level, that she was cherished, protected, and free to become whoever she was meant to be. Here, in this small family unit, there were no designations of defect or limitation, no predetermined paths or expectations. Only love, acceptance, and the infinite possibilities that came with both. For Lyra, who had once defined herself by all the things she could never have or be, this was the greatest miracle of all, greater even than the biological impossibility of Nova's existence. She had found not just acceptance, but belonging, not just purpose, but love. Her body, once deemed too large, too different, too wrong, had created life against all odds. But more importantly, in loving that life and the man who had helped create it, she had finally come home to herself,